On today's Locked On Bucks, we take a look ahead at 3 games that should be winnable games for the Milwaukee Bucks. And most importantly, Camille and Frank started to get into this over the weekend. We've talked about it for a couple of days now, but have the Bucks started to find their groove again? We'll get into that conversation and preview the series with the Charlotte Hornets coming up next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I am Justin Garcia, joined by Camille Davis. You can hear me on the Bucks Radio Network. You can find Camille on the Technical Foul podcast and the Carry the G in MKE podcast. We both thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen each and every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts and viewable on YouTube as well. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your best bet of $5 or more wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Camille, I suppose we have to start with where you and Frank left off, and that was another win by this team. A good start out of the AllStar break. To win on the road in Minnesota, a place where the Timberwolves have been very good. And oh, by the way, a Timberwolves team that is still the co-leader in the Western Conference. And then winning in Philadelphia. I don't care about not having Joel Embiid. I've seen a lot of that clapback and chatter too. They still had Tyrese Maxey, Tobias Harris. They're still coached by Nick Nurse. And it was still a game where, a lot of players on that team were certainly up for that game, going against Doc Rivers, going against the Bucks, as there's been this little rivalry. So it's still a big win because, again, these are games you should win if you're not going against Joel Embiid. And as we've talked about, that's the importance of this last 4 or so 25 games for the Bucks is, you're going to have to beat good teams, but it's especially evident today and the next couple of days. You got to beat those teams that you're going to be favored against.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the 76ers game, definitely understand they did not have Joel Embiid. That's missing a huge part of what they do. I won't downplay that, but it's not as if the 76ers were coming out in this game it's whatever. If we don't win, we don't win. We're not trying as hard as we can. The 76ers are also in the place right now in the standings now where they're the 5th seed in the East. They're a game behind the Knicks in the loss column. They're 2 games behind, or now 3 games behind the Bucks in the loss column. And right behind them, they have the Heat, who are only 1 game behind them in the loss column, and then the Pacers and the Magic, who are only 2 games behind them in the loss column. The 76ers came out in this game knowing that they needed this win just as bad as the Bucks knew they wanted to get this win as well. That's the joy about basketball after the All-Star break, where it's only 25, 26 games left. And all these teams are looking at the standings and understanding that they need to play their best ball. They need to get these wins because playoff positioning, that's what they're jockeying for right now. So, yes, the 76ers did not have Joel Embiid, but as you mentioned, they still had Tyrese Maxey. They had the same head coach. The rest of the team was there for the most part. So although it wasn't with Joel Embiid, I do think it's still a good win for the Bucks because we've talked about this team and how they need to stack success. And after they beat the Timberwolves and Giannis came out and he said, well, if we don't show up on Sunday against Philly, this doesn't mean anything anyways. We saw before the break, they had that great win against Denver, which at the time was arguably their best win of the season. And then they followed that up with losing to the Jimmy Butler-less Miami
Everybody
Heat.
lets Miami Heat.
Right. And then they lost to the Memphis Grizzlies, who, like I mentioned, their injury report looks like a CVS receipt. And you lost that game going into the break. So you want to see this team stack success. So yeah, I was very happy with that Philly win. It was a great win coming off of that Timberwolves win. And now they follow it up with 2 games against the Charlotte Hornets, who have been playing better ball since the trade deadline, but they're still a 15-win team at the moment. And then they see Chicago, who has been really up and down throughout this season, but that's a team that you would expect for them to still beat. So yeah, it was a good win in my book, and we need to see the Bucks continuing to stack those wins going forward.
So a couple of things to piggyback off of that. I saw a few people point out too when I mentioned it. Everybody mentioned, this is the third time in the last 6 games that the Bucks held an opponent under 100 points, and a few people responded to me of, "So what? It was the Sixers without Embiid, and it was the Charlotte Hornets." Like, okay, but one of those was the Denver Nuggets. The Charlotte Hornets have been pretty good since the trade deadline. I think the Bucks are the only team or the last team to beat them since then. I'm not suggesting they're a playoff team, but they've been good there. And, the 76ers, who cares if they don't have Joel Embiid? They've still been scoring more than 100 points for any team. I don't care who's on the floor.
Yep.
With the way offense is in the league these days, if you hold a team under 100 points, that's an accomplishment, regardless of who it is. And, the other part of this is it was imperative that you got this start that you did these first 2 games, because not that we were doom and gloom and fear mongers with this team, but, we pointed out the last time that we were together here, being realistic, and that loss against the Memphis Grizzlies, what that really meant for this team. You go into the break 4 games back of the Cavs in the loss column. I've gone over it a lot, so I won't get into the specifics again, but winning the tiebreaker versus Cleveland is going to be tough. You're basically going to have to pass them in the standings because you split the season series, and they're likely going to finish with a better divisional record. So all of those things added up. The Cavs have a much easier schedule than the Bucks. So you just kind of figured, man, this seals us off at 3 in all likelihood. And now you got to worry about the New York Knicks getting healthy. Maybe not so much the 76ers, but I saw a lot of people suggesting, well, the Bucks are going to be in the play-in tournament. And you came out of, we'll get to that in a second. You came out of the All-Star break with a lot of help, with the Cavaliers dropping 2 straight games. And it made that game in Minnesota all the more important of, look, they've given you help. You have to take advantage of that. They did. And as you just mentioned, to a man, we heard it from Bobby. We heard it from Doc Rivers. We heard it from Giannis. Look, that win in Minnesota was great. We got to win in Philly. We got to start to build on these wins and find that consistency. It can't just be a one and done, because then we're right back in the same spot. So they did that. And now the interesting part is, it's going to kick up again after this week. But at least for right now, the Bucks have slid all the way down to 6th with most difficult schedule remaining. And it's the second most challenging in the Eastern Conference behind tonight's opponent, the Charlotte Hornets.
Yeah, getting the leading team in the West out of the way can definitely help with that strength of schedule as Philly as well. But just final thoughts too on those games and talking about the defense. We've mentioned so many times about how there were signs since the coaching switch that the defense was improving. I don't care if Joel Embiid was not out there. The fact that the Bucks held the 76ers to 16 points in the fourth quarter, when the 76ers knew, like, hey, they were able to close that gap, and then they're like, okay, we have some momentum. 16 points, and 11 of those points came after the benches were thrown in. So I was going to
say 16 points, and a lot of that came in garbage time.
Exactly. It was really 5 points that they held them to, like the first 8.5 minutes of the fourth quarter. Like, that's ridiculous effort on defense. And I loved hearing Malik Beasley coming out afterwards and talking about that, like saying, like, we are really seeing our effort pay off and how they're buying into that and they're playing together. They're talking, like saying, hey, we've never talked this much before. Like, we're communicating really well on all of our switches. Like, we're seeing it happen. So a 16-point fourth quarter followed by the 13-point third quarter they held the Wolves to. Like, that defense is really ramping up, and the Timberwolves had their full assortment of players during that game. So to see what they've been doing defensively, like, I don't care if Joel Embiid wasn't there in that one. Like, it's again showing the progress this team is making, and we got to see that continue. But that's something that I heard about the Hornets as well, where they're talking about, like, how is the play so much better? And the coach was like, it sounds bad, but like, guys they're trying. Like, the effort level is higher, and you can see that a bit with the Bucks as well. Like, you can see how much they bought into this defensive system. They understand what their roles are. They understand where they should be, what they should be doing, and they're executing it really, really well at the moment. And you hope to see that continue to build, because I love Doc Rivers coming out and mentioning that we don't have speed We don't have a lot of speed on this team, but we have length and we have size. So we're going to try to take advantage of that. And I just love hearing the head coach mention like, hey, here's where we're weak at, but this is how we can overcome that.
Yeah, the Hornets are trying, and it's a much different group of players. Some better players on the floor is a big part of their recent play as well. We'll get into some of those numbers for the Charlotte Hornets, but you mentioned the defense. I do want to talk about what we're seeing defensively over the course of these last 12 games and for a lesser extent the 15 since the coaching change, because there's a lot of similarities of the same story we've mentioned for the last 2-3 weeks now, but you've started to see consistency with that. So we'll get into that conversation coming up after the break. Well, time to talk to you about our friends at Quiz. And Camille, I have a question for you. I assume you're going to know the answer to this, but do you know which player holds the record for most points scored in a single game for the Milwaukee Bucks? Is it Damian Lillard, Ray Allen, Oscar Robertson, or Giannis Antetokounmpo?
The answer to that question would be Giannis. We just saw that this season.
It's definitely Giannis Antetokounmpo. If you're a Bucks fan, you know that. Maybe you want to learn more about other teams, and that's where Quiz is here to help. That's Quiz with 3 eyes. It's the next generation trivia experience. It is also the world's first platform where you can earn money playing knowledge games. And for Locked On Bucks fans, we've created an NBA quiz game where you can test your knowledge and win real cash. Play with friends or other fans and let your knowledge shine all the way to the bank. You can play without downloading anything. Just go to app.quiz.com and start playing today. NBA Quiz is the ultimate knowledge challenge for fans that live and breathe basketball. Go to app.quiz.com to test your knowledge and win cash today. That's Quiz with 3 eyes, just like a 3-pointer. Play now, showcase your skills, and take home the cash prizes. App.quiz.com, where fans become champions. And Locked On has also launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. It is now viewable as well on Amazon Fire in the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top stories of the day with the local experts you've come to expect from Locked On, plus all the national shows we have covering every single league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. I mentioned some of the numbers that we had seen defensively for this team. What stands out to me the most, Camille, is all of these numbers. It's not surprising because we started to point to this after 4 or 5 games of, it kind of feels like this defense looks different. And sure enough, by the numbers it did. But now just looking at the Doc Rivers segment, and that's been the interesting part about this season is how many segments we viewed. It started with since November 3rd, and then it was since the coaching change. And now Doc has had more of a runway that you look at since January 29th when Doc coached his game. I think we're probably going to shift towards post All-Star break. Here's what the Bucks have looked like. But in the games that Doc has coached, 12 of them, the Bucks are 5-7. And look, same thing that we talked about of people trying to take a little bit out of that win against the 76ers. 5-7 to me in 6-9, 6-8, 7-8, sorry, since the coaching change. I still think that's relatively impressive given the schedule that the Bucks played. When you think about who was on there, not just the road games and 5 games away from home that Doc had to start with 1 practice that you could squeeze in Dallas, but 2 games against the Cavs, who are second in the Eastern Conference, 2 games against the Nuggets, who are just outside of the top spot in the West, 2 games against the Minnesota Timberwolves. So Phoenix Suns too, when they were starting to play better and had everybody. So it's been incredibly challenging to basically be 500 while dealing with a coaching change and changing some things. To me is impressive, but by the numbers, what stands out the most is they have basically become better than league average and pretty close to the top 10 in every one of those metrics that you would point to when you look at the 4 factors. Defensively, looking at cleaning the glass, taking out the garbage time, they have the 12th best defensive rating in those 12 games played under Doc Rivers. They're in the middle of the pack in what the opponent's effective field goal percentage is. They're 12th in turnover rate, which it went from 30th to 12th. That's the most impressive one. Went from close to 20th in defensive rebounding. I think it was around 17 or so to 13th. So that's been better. And free throw rate has been pretty constant, but they're forcing turnovers without really fouling. They're 7th best in opponent trips to the free throw line. So that to me, it shows you, look, we started to see this after a couple of games. If anything, it's gotten better as they've played a tough schedule. So that I think shows you what we're seeing. It's for real. And I think the expectations that we talked about for a while now of, I think this team has shown enough. And Doc has even joked, don't let anybody tell you can't play defense. We've seen you do it. So now we expect it. But it's a 12-game sample that shows you, yeah, I think if we look at the post All-Star break schedule, it is realistic to expect this team to finish somewhere between 10th to 14th in defensive rating.
Yeah. And earlier in the season, I wasn't sure if that was going to be possible. I was thinking like, hey, if you guys can just be average at best, and that was at best at that time, like just be average and the offense remain elite, there's something that can happen here. And as we've mentioned throughout the All-Star break and episodes that we did, then really breaking down how the team was performing, what we were seeing, what we thought we might see coming out of the break, the defense has continued to stand up. 2 very impressive performances against the Timberwolves and then the 76ers coming out of the break. But the other half of that is looking for that offense to really get going, because under Griff, that was a very elite offense. But what we're starting to see now, it feels as if the team is really starting to get comfortable with what their roles are going to be offensively as well. On the Pat Bev podcast, he was mentioning the fact that him and Dame had a sit down and they talked things through with their problems. But the part of that really stood out to me was Pat Beverly telling Dame, like, hey, those 40-foot shots you be seeing, like when we're doing our skeleton offense and we're drawing things up, shoot those shots, like shoot them. And Dame's looking at him kind of like, what? And he's like, we need to get used to that, because come playoff time, you're going to be getting 25, 30, like 25 shots a game. Like that's what's going to happen. And he said, and you normally see that happen on teams where come playoff time, the star players are getting their 25 shots up, and there might be some bench guys being like, man, y'all out here gunning. Like y'all need to chill out, pass the ball, move the ball around. And Pat Bev is like, no, that's what they're supposed to do. Like it's playoff time. The ball is in the hands of your stars. That's what's supposed to happen. You hear Giannis echoing that, saying like, hey, down the stretch, we got to get the ball in the hands of our best players. We understand that now after the Timberwolves game. And I love Pat telling Dame, like, we need you to shoot this. And Dame being like, I never thought about it that way. Like, you're right. And they're all just seemingly define what this comfort zone is going to be for this offense, which is the other part of it. Like, I'm glad the defense is picking up. That goes a long way of helping this team. But again, we make that Dame trade for an offensive spark, for that firepower. And I also love hearing that a bench guy like Pat, who's going to have a strong voice, as we know how Pat Beverly gets down, is already setting expectations like, hey guys, like understand playoff time is star time. Like we might not get our shots as the bench guys. We just have to be ready and play our roles to the best of our abilities, because it's going to be on Dame. It's going to be on Giannis, even on Khris. Like that's going to be where a lot of the offense is going to come from here. So we have to get used to that now. And coming out of the break, seeing how Dame has been really aggressive, looking for his shot, shooting the ball pretty well. Like even in the Timberwolves game where he didn't shoot well, just overall from the field, what he did in the fourth quarter when it's like, hey, we understand you've had a rough shooting go so far, but like we got to get you going. And they put the ball in his hands and he made the right decisions, hit the clutch shots. That's the other piece of it as well, where it's like, we want to see that offense start to tick up still, because you're looking at the numbers still here. Since Doc Rivers took over, the Bucks are about 20th in that offensive rating. And we know we've seen it so far this season that they can score, like they can put up more points than that. But you just want to see that continue trending upward coming out of the break as well, and the team getting more comfortable with each other and what their roles are going to be and accepting that.
So we've talked a lot about the defense, and I think at this point it's pretty clear what they're doing, right? They're rebounding, they're taking away points in the paint, second chance opportunities, they're limiting transition as well. They're doing better in it. I think a lot of that has to do with fewer transition opportunities for the opponents. I know the numbers floated around a lot in the last couple of days too. They've given up the fewest fast break points in the league. Obviously, the caveat is that it's not the same as transition. You can score on a make in both, but A fast break just has to do with how quickly you're scoring. But it all adds up to the low-hanging fruit that they've grabbed.
Mhm.
When you consider, too, there's no massive personnel changes, right? You added Pat
Right.
Beverly. That's it. So it's Doc Rivers basically coming in and saying, here's what we're not going to do. So let's just stop doing this and let's grab all those pieces of low-hanging fruit we can, and that'll boost the defense. That's what we've seen. Offensively is where the chirping has come. And you mentioned it too, that they're 20th under Doc Rivers. But look, I've pointed this out. We all have. It is fair to point out Khris Middleton has missed 9 of those games in these last 15 games. 9, basically. 8 technically, but he played 7 minutes against the Suns. He's played 110 minutes total since Doc Rivers arrived. So that is a huge component. You had 3 games without Brook Lopez. You had 2 games without Damian Lillard. So that all factors in. But to me, what I kind of hang my hat on and say, look, I'm not worried about the offense yet. Even when people push back and say, well, I mean, who cares if Khris Middleton's gone? You still got Giannis and Damian Lillard. Number one, we've seen this team at their best, as we pointed to, when they play the best teams in the league. They still have, at last check, the 3rd best win percentage against the top 10 teams in the NBA. And the minutes where you've had your best players on the floor is where it's even more impressive for this Bucks team, that you can it's been non-existent basically. It has been non-existent in the second half. You haven't seen it all that much under Doc Rivers, so it's not worth pointing out, well, under Doc, here it is with the guys. But in those minutes where Giannis and Dame and Khris and Brook Lopez are on the floor, they have a plus 16 net rating. They have a 125.7 offensive rating, which would be number 1 in the league, and a 109.3 defensive rating, which I believe would be second best in the league. So when you have that group out there, they've been pretty good. And the other thing that I do think is worth mentioning is, look, while the Bucks are 20th in overall offensive efficiency under Doc, they're 10th in half-court offense. And when you look at all the teams that are in the top 10, for the most part, I think all but the Bucks and the Clippers, they are all teams that are in the top 10 of offense. So those are the 2 teams that are, our offense hasn't been great, but half court, where you need it and where it's most important in the playoffs, they've been pretty good. So that's another reason why it's, look, as long as this team is healthy, I'm not overly concerned.
Yeah, and that's the optimism that comes with this team right now, because we understand here how important Khris Middleton is to this team. Outside of Giannis and Dame, there are no other real shot creators who can get their own shot when they want it outside of Khris Middleton. Now, you might want to point to Bobby Portis. He likes to get his buckets, but it's a little bit different in the way he does than how Khris Middleton can get to his buckets and get to his spots and put up shots. So you need Khris Middleton on this team, especially come playoff time when the rotations shrink, the minutes increase, and then you're able to stagger when people do need to go sit on the bench. You can make sure that you have Khris, Giannis, or Dame out there at all times. So I love that you pointed out the fact of what their numbers look like in the half court, because this is all about playoff basketball. I've seen some fans saying, I don't really care about any of this happening right now. Wake me up when the playoffs start, because that's going to be the real test. And in the playoff, we know everything slows down so much, and you need to be effective in the half court. And seeing the early returns of this team being effective in half court in a lot of those games without Khris Middleton, you can only imagine that it's going to improve once he comes back and once he's healthy. Seeing their play, we've talked about the defense already, and seeing their play, if this team is healthy, I feel really good about them in a 7-game series with how they've been playing over the last few weeks, even though there were all those L's that came in there. There's reasons behind that for sure. Understand, but give me a fully healthy Bucks team, and I like their chances against most teams in the East.
Yeah, really all but one. And even then, I'm not ruling them out for the most part.
And even that.
So there is one other number that I even hesitate to share, but I'll do it anyway after the break. And also take a look at these 2 games against the Charlotte Hornets. We mentioned a much different team. They've been playing a lot better. How much better and why? We will take a look at that coming up after the break. Well, this episode of Locked On Bucks is sponsored by BetterHelp. And look, we've all dealt with this throughout the course of the season. Past New Year's, that's a time that everybody tries to look forward and how can I improve myself? Maybe you set a New Year's resolution. Maybe you tackle things by months and you want to get better month to month to month. Maybe you organized a part of your space and now you want to organize something else. Maybe you're focusing on your health and taking supplements, and now you want to branch out into the rest of your diet. These are all places where BetterHelp and therapy can help you find your strengths so you can ditch extreme resolutions and make changes that really stick. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It is entirely online, and it's designed to be convenient, flexible, and most importantly, suited to your schedule. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire. From there, you'll get matched with a licensed therapist. You can even switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So celebrate the progress you have already made. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedonnba and get 10% off your first month today. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedonnba. And time to talk to you about FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. If you're like me, this is a busy time of the year with everything we got going on. You got basketball hitting its full swing, the NHL trade deadline. You got trades coming up there, hockey games before you know it. College basketball is here as well. A lot of sports, and that's where FanDuel is here to serve you. They have many ways for you to start your season with a W or 2 or even 3. And now you can bet on virtually anything that is out there. New customers join today. You'll get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. That is FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports book partner of the NFL. All right, these Charlotte Hornets, Camille, we mentioned they've been a much better team really since the Bucks last beat them. I believe the Bucks are the last team to have beaten the Hornets dating back to the trade deadline, but nonetheless, they've been playing a lot better. And you look at the players that are on the floor, that number one is, to me, what stands out the most and the biggest difference in what we've seen from this Hornets team of late. If we go all the way back to that last matchup between the Bucks and the Hornets, a blowout win by the Bucks. They won by 36. It was the day after the trade deadline. The Charlotte Hornets starting lineup that day was Cody Martin, a big piece, Brandon Miller, who, again, right around the time he started playing much, much better, Nick Richards, Leaky Black, and final starter there, Miles Bridges. After that, you were talking about guys like JT Thor that were still getting time. Amari Bailey played in that game. Bryce McGowan. So it was a rotation full of players that weren't NBA players. They have since added Trey Mann, Grant Williams, Vasile Micic, who have all been big parts, Seth Curry as well. So they've added more NBA caliber players. Davis Bertans, another one. And it's starting to show. And look, Steve Clifford has been as outspoken as any coach so far this season, especially when it comes to the challenges of coaching young players. But you've given them some pros. And I think that is very important as well for a guy like Brandon Miller, who we had mentioned really started to play a lot better, starting with around that time against the Bucks. And now he gets to develop around better players. So when you look at the standings, Hornets are not a good team, right? They're 15-42. That is the third worst record in the Eastern Conference. It's the fourth worst record in basketball. But it does seem like with these changes, and certainly with the way that this team has been playing of late, 5-5 in their last 10 games now, they're closer to those teams just in front of them, the Nets and the Raptors, than they are the Wizards and the Pistons.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did double check. So after we beat them, the Bucks beat the Hornets. They went 5-1. Their only loss was against Golden State. And even
Yeah.
that score, I'm looking at the scores and I'm like, this feels very like 90-ish. Like they lost to Golden State 97-84, but then they beat Portland 93-80. Like that's a wild score. I know in that game Portland was missing a lot of threes, but I haven't seen a score like that in quite some time in this new NBA. But to your point, Cody Martin getting healthy is a big part for them. Like we know they've been without LaMelo Ball, but if you're looking at what's been really fueling the Hornets, it's been their defense. Like the Hornets had the last ranked defense in the NBA at the deadline. They were giving up almost 122 points per 100 possessions. And since February 10th, when they finally were able to have their new acquired trade pieces in play, they have actually been the number one defense in the NBA, just allowing 99.9 points per 100 possessions. Like that's impressive to see how they've been tightening the screws a bit with that. Like they held one opponent under 100 points in the first 53 games, and they've done it 3 in the last 4. So when you're looking at the Hornets, it's like, okay, well, how is this happening? Like, what is going on with them? And like, okay, they played Memphis, they played Indiana, they played Atlanta, Utah, Golden State, Portland. And again, I mentioned that Portland game, you were seeing them Portland missed a lot of shots, and you're just like, this is strange. Like they're just not knocking anything down. So it's a Hornets team that's getting a little bit healthier. They're buying into their identity. Like at this point, I'm sure they're not looking at the standings thinking like, hey, let's be a playing team. But maybe they are. I'm not going to knock them if they're trying to get there at this point. But really, in my mind, it's a team that's looking forward already to next season and trying to figure out what pieces are going to be able to remain, what can be built upon, what's really real, and trying to at least go into the offseason just on a good note. So it's a Hornets team that, like we said, it's not the same team that we saw when they got blown out by 36 points. It's a team that's playing with a bit more pride, a bit more effort. They're talking more. The trade pieces that they were able to bring in, having Grant Williams help anchor the defense has been a big help for them. Cody being healthy has been a big help for them. Still don't expect to see LaMelo Ball back tonight, but and we know he seems to really enjoy playing against the Milwaukee Bucks. But the Hornets have been playing some good ball since they finally were able to get all of their trade pieces together. All that said, still expect the Bucks to come out here and take care of business. Like it's going to be a more difficult challenge than what the Bucks saw earlier in the season when they faced the Hornets, but yet and still, it's a 15-win team and you need to take care of business.
Yeah, and the last thing there is LaMelo Ball is listed as out for tonight's game. Seth Curry was on the injury report. He is expected to play, though. So all of those additions that they made, Davis Bertans is questionable. He may be the only one. But all the changes to the roster since the deadline are probably going to be on the floor tonight. Khris Middleton will not, and that wasn't a big surprise, as you kind of gathered that from Doc Rivers Sunday in Philadelphia. But to me, it feels like maybe Friday, but maybe Monday, we see Khris Middleton back. As Doc has said, he feels good. He's very close. I don't know if it'll be the next game. I don't know that you would have Khris Middleton play Thursday in Charlotte. He's certainly, I would assume, not going to be playing on both ends of a back-to-back going forward. So maybe Chicago on Friday night. Maybe it's home against the Clippers on Monday in a huge game. But it is very, very close for Khris Middleton making his return to the floor. And that's the last thing about this matchup with the Hornets is I mentioned Frank had pointed this out yesterday too. The Bucks remain very, very good against those teams with the best top 10 ratings, top 10 rating teams in the league. Bucks have been one of the best teams in the league against those clubs so far this season, with the third best win percentage in those games. That's been pretty constant for the duration of this season. They've played their best against the best teams in the league. They're 11-7. Only the Oklahoma City Thunder and Boston Celtics are better. Celtics are 11-5. Thunder are 13-6. The issue for the Bucks has been the teams that you're going to play basically the next 3 games, at least 2 of the next 3 games. In the Hornets with 2 games, and the Chicago Bulls then on Friday. As you know, the Bucks in those games have a win percentage of 72.7, which, you know, fine, but those are the teams you should really be beating up on, 16-6, and they just haven't. So how you turn it around, and again, the larger point that we started the show with, building that consistency and continuing to find that is going to be the big thing for this team. That the final thing here, that number that I pointed to and said, look, I hesitate to even share this because it's not a large sample size, but that is the post All-Star break ratings here for the Bucks. And look, it's 2 games, so that's the caveat and why I hesitate to even bring this up. But it just backs up confidence in what you're seeing. And in those 2 games against 2 good opponents, Bucks are in the top 5 or just outside of it in both offense and defense. So I think it's the 6th best offense, 2nd best defense in those 2 games since the All-Star break. So just continue to build on that. And this team should be in a good spot. Last thing I'll point out, Camille, is what we touched on with the help that you got coming out of the break.
Yeah.
You might get some more of that tonight because you have the Cavs playing. They host the Dallas Mavericks, who just had their win streak end, but they've been playing very good. The Knicks playing. They host the Pelicans, who have been very good of late. And the Sixers and Celtics play each other. So you're going to either continue to separate yourself from Philly, or maybe you get a little bit of help and gain some ground on Boston, though, as we mentioned, don't focus on the Celtics. It's probably not going to happen. But those teams around you in the standings with difficult opponents. So if you beat a team you're supposed to beat, we could wake up tomorrow and the Bucks are a game back of the Cavs in the loss column and tied with them in the standings, and maybe even 3 up on the Knicks in the loss column.
Yeah, and you love to see that. Like, I was thinking best case scenario probably would be 2 seed for this team. And if things continue the way that they have been, with the Bucks getting that help from whoever's playing against the Cavaliers, whoever's playing against the Knicks, you absolutely take that. So in addition to watching Bucks games, I would definitely encourage Bucks fans just to keep an eye on the rest of the league. Keep an eye on what the Cavaliers are doing, what the Knicks are doing, and just be aware because those games definitely have an impact on what the Bucks are doing. 76ers as well, even the Heat and the Pacers and the Magic, who have one of the easiest schedules going forward. So just keeping an eye on the teams near the Bucks, in addition to watching the Bucks, is going to be a good bet.
Yeah, and as of this moment, playoff status has the Bucks with a 36% chance to get the 3 seed, 25% chance at the 2 seed. They give the Cavaliers a 58% chance. So according to their models, you're going to have the Celtics, Cavs, Bucks in that order, but it gets interesting after that. The Knicks have a 25% chance at the 4 seed. The Philadelphia 76ers. Would you care in our final moments here to wager a guess at the probability they have for the seed, most probable for the Sixers?
Most probable for the Sixers. They're currently 5 now. They haven't played well without Embiid. I would say like 6. Do they have them around 6, 7?
8 is
Wow.
where they have them most likely to finish, which again, be careful what you wish for then when you look at the play-in tournament of the 7 and 8 seeds. If we're talking about Indiana and Philly and you're the 2 seed and you're getting one of those teams, who knows? So I think ideally, if you're the Bucks, look, if we finish 3rd, fine, as long as it's not the Miami Heat that finish 6th. Maybe the Orlando Magic can jump up to that 6th spot. We'll be back once again tonight with a recap of that game, the first of 2 against the Charlotte Hornets, and hopefully we continue to see this team building on what we saw over the weekend. For Camille, I am Justin. We will talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.